Jake Turner was in the middle of organizing his tools in the garage when he heard the sound of a delivery truck pulling up outside. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the driveway, curious about the unexpected visitor. The deliverman stepped out of the truck holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. The arrangement was extravagant, bursting with vibrant reds, yellows, and pinks, with a small white envelope nestled in the center. "Jake Turner?" the deliverman asked. "That's me," Jake replied, glancing at the bouquet in confusion. "Special delivery," the man said with a grin, handing the flowers over. Jake frowned as he took them. He hadn't ordered any flowers, and they certainly didn't look like something meant for him. Then he spotted the name on the tag. "To Andrea Turner," his wife. Jake's heart sank as he carried the bouquet into the house, his mind already racing. Andrea wasn't home yet. She had told him she was meeting a friend for lunch and would be back in a few hours. Setting the bouquet on the kitchen counter, Jake reached for the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it and pulled out the card inside. "To Andrea, thinking of you always." Greg, asterisk, asterisk. Jake stared at the card, his breath catching in his throat. The name, Greg, felt like a punch to the gut. He didn't know anyone named Greg, and Andrea had never mentioned the name before. Who the hell is Greg? When Andrea arrived home later that afternoon, Jake was waiting for her in the living room. The bouquet sat on the coffee table, the card propped up against the vase. Andrea froze when she saw it, her eyes widening. "Oh," she said nervously, forcing a laugh. "Those are lovely. Did you?" "No," Jake interrupted, his voice cold. "I didn't." Andrea's smile faltered. "Then, where did they come from?" Jake gestured to the card. "Why don't you tell me? Who's Greg?" Andrea's face turned pale as she picked up the card, her hands trembling. I don't know," she stammered. "This must be some kind of mistake." "A mistake?" Jake repeated, his tone sharp. "The flowers were delivered here, Andrea. To you. And the card has your name on it. So tell me again, who is Greg?" Andrea set the card down, her gaze darting around the room. "Jake, I swear, I have no idea who this is. Maybe it's from work or something. A client, maybe." Jake crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "A client? Since when do clients send flowers to their married co-workers with notes that say thinking of you always?" Andrea opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence between them was deafening. Jake stood abruptly, his chest tight with anger and hurt. "You've been acting strange lately, Andrea. Coming home late, saying you're meeting friends, but never mentioning names. And now this?" Andrea's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "It's not what you think, Jake. I swear." "Then what is it?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you've been lying to me." Andrea reached for him, but Jake stepped back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I need the truth, Andrea," he said firmly. "No more lies, no more excuses. Who is Greg, and why is he sending you flowers?" Andrea hesitated, her tears spilling over. "Jake, please," she whispered. "It's not what it seems." "Then tell me what it is," Jake said coldly. Andrea sat down on the couch, her hands trembling as she picked up the card again. She stared at it, as though willing it to provide an explanation she could give Jake. "I don't know," she whispered finally. Jake's laugh was bitter, cutting through the tense air. "You don't know? That's all you've got?" Andrea looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading. "I mean it, Jake. I've never met anyone named Greg. I don't know why someone would send me these flowers." Jake shook his head, pacing the living room. "Do you really expect me to believe that?" Flowers like this don't just show up out of nowhere. And the note? Thinking of you always? That doesn't sound like something a stranger would write. Andrea wiped at her tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe they were meant for someone else. Jake stopped pacing, his gaze hard. A mistake? The delivery guy asked for you by name, Andrea. The card has your name on it. How do you explain that? Andrea opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her silence only deepened Jake's suspicion. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths as Jake sat down across from her, his jaw clenched. You've been distant lately, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. You're always on your phone, always finding excuses to be out of the house. And now this? If you're hiding something, Andrea, just say it. I'd rather hear the truth than keep playing these games. Andrea's tears spilled over as she shook her head. Jake, I swear, I'm not hiding anything. I love you, and I would never stop. Jake interrupted, holding up his hand. Don't lie to me, Andrea. If you love me, then be honest. Who is Greg? Andrea looked down, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the conversation had finally crushed her. Jake watched her carefully, his stomach twisting. He wanted to believe her, to believe that the flowers were some kind of misunderstanding. But the doubts in his mind were too loud to ignore. You're not leaving this room until I get some answers, Jake said firmly. Andrea glanced up at him, her eyes filled with desperation. Jake, I've been going through a lot lately, she began hesitantly. Jake narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? Andrea hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Work's been stressful. I've been feeling overwhelmed. And sometimes I just need to get away, to clear my head. Clear your head? Jake repeated, his voice sharp. Is that what you were doing today? Clearing your head while meeting someone named Greg? Andrea shook her head quickly. No, I was with Marissa. I told you that. We had lunch downtown. Then call her, Jake said, crossing his arms. Right now. Andrea froze, her eyes widening. What? Call Marissa, Jake repeated. If you were with her, she'll back up your story. So go ahead. Andrea reached for her phone, her hand shaking. Jake's eyes never left her as she scrolled through her contacts and pressed Marissa's name. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Marissa picked up. Hey, Andrea. Marissa's cheerful voice came through the speaker. Hi, Andrea said quickly, her voice trembling. I just wanted to check in and see if you got home okay. Yeah, I'm good, Marissa replied. Lunch was great. We should do it again soon. Jake's jaw tightened as he listened. Andrea's alibi was holding up, but the doubts in his mind refused to ease. Andrea forced a laugh. Definitely. I'll call you later, okay? Sure. Take care. Andrea ended the call and set her phone down, looking up at Jake with tear-filled eyes. See? I was with her. I'm not lying to you. Jake stared at her, his chest tight with anger and frustration. Then explain the flowers, he said coldly. Because that phone call doesn't change the fact that someone named Greg sent them to you. Andrea stood abruptly, pacing the room. I don't know, Jake. Maybe it's a prank, or maybe someone's trying to mess with me. I can't explain it, but I swear, I'm not cheating on you. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. A prank? That's the best you got? Do you think I'm stupid, Andrea? No, Andrea cried, turning to face him. I don't think that. I don't know what else to say. Jake's voice dropped, quiet but deadly. Then let me make this clear. If you're lying to me, Andrea, if you've been seeing someone else, I will find out. And if that happens, we're done. Do you understand me? Andrea's tears fell harder as she nodded, her body trembling. I understand, she whispered. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment of their argument. He wanted to believe Andrea, to trust that the woman he had married was telling him the truth. But the flowers, the card, the name, Greg, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Jake made a decision. If Andrea wasn't going to give him answers, he would find them himself. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As Andrea moved through the motions of their daily life, her usual routine seemed forced, her smiles hollow. Jake watched her closely, studying her every word and gesture, looking for cracks in her story. But Andrea's insistence that she didn't know Greg and that the flowers were a mistake stayed consistent. She doubled down on her alibi with Marissa, volunteering more details about their lunch to reinforce her version of events. Jake didn't buy it. The first step in his investigation was simple. He searched Andrea's phone while she was in the shower. Jake hated invading her privacy, but the doubt gnawed at him relentlessly. Her call log matched what she had told him. She had spoken to Marissa before and after their supposed lunch. But as he scrolled through her text messages, his stomach tightened. There were no messages from anyone named Greg. In fact, many of her texts seemed unusually generic, as though conversations had been deleted. Jake moved to her email next. He found work correspondence, promotional offers, and mundane exchanges with family. But then, buried in her trash folder, he found an email chain that made his heart race. The sender's name read, Gregor. The subject line was unassuming. Dinner plans? Jake opened the email, his pulse pounding. Greg, looking forward to seeing you tonight. The reservation is confirmed. I'll make sure the flowers arrive earlier this time. You deserve to feel special. The email was dated 2 days before the flowers had arrived. Jake's chest tightened as he stared at the screen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He scrolled further down the thread, finding more messages exchanged over the past month. Greg, last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. Andrea, me too. But we need to be careful. Jake slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking. The evidence was damning. Andrea had lied. She had been lying for weeks, maybe longer. That evening, Jake confronted Andrea as soon as she walked through the door. Who is Greg? He asked, his voice cold and steady. Andrea froze, her face going pale. Jake, I already told you. Don't lie to me. Jake interrupted, holding up her phone. I went through your emails. I saw the messages. I know everything. Andrea's eyes widened, and she took a step back. You went through my phone? Jake's laugh was bitter. You don't get to be mad about that, Andrea. Not when you've been sneaking around behind my back. Andrea's shoulders slumped, and tears filled her eyes. Jake, it's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. It's not what I think, Jake repeated, his voice rising. So you weren't emailing him? You weren't meeting him? You didn't lie to me about where you were? Andrea sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered. Jake's chest ached as he stared at her, his anger bubbling over. You didn't mean for what to happen. Say it, Andrea. Say it out loud. I was lonely, Andrea cried, her voice breaking. I felt like we were drifting apart, like we were just roommates. And then Greg started reaching out, and I let it happen. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. How long? Andrea looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. A few months, she admitted. Jake shook his head, his voice bitter. A few months. How generous of you to finally tell me the truth. Andrea stepped closer, her hands outstretched. Jake, please. It didn't mean anything. It was it was a distraction. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me. Jake spat, stepping back. You've been lying to me for months, meeting another man, and you didn't want to hurt me? What did you think would happen when I found out? Andrea sobbed harder, her body trembling. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I love you, Jake. I love you, and I want to fix this. Please don't give up on us. Jake's laughter was bitter and cold. You don't get to say that, Andrea. You don't get to play the victim here. You made this choice. You destroyed our marriage. Andrea fell to her knees, her sobs shaking her frame. I'll do whatever it takes, she whispered. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just give me a chance to make it right. Jake stared at her, his heart heavy with anger and grief. I need time, he said finally, his voice shaking. Time to figure out if I can ever forgive you. If I can ever trust you again. Andrea nodded quickly, her tears falling harder. Take all the time you need, she said desperately. Just don't leave me, Jake. Please. That night, Jake slept on the couch, unable to bring himself to share a bed with Andrea. As he lay awake in the dark, his mind churned with questions. Could he forgive her? Could their marriage survive this betrayal? He didn't know. But one thing was certain, things would never be the same. Jake had always thought of himself as a rational man. He'd weathered tough times before, financial struggles, the stress of balancing work and family, but nothing had prepared him for the storm raging in his heart now. Andrea's betrayal was like a wound that refused to heal, raw and festering with every passing day. Andrea, for her part, did everything she could to show her remorse. She canceled all plans outside the house, deleted Greg's contact information in front of Jake, and handed over her phone and email passwords without hesitation. But every gesture, every tear-filled apology, felt like too little too late. Their home, once a place of comfort, now felt suffocating. Jake found himself avoiding Andrea, retreating to the garage or taking long drives to clear his head. But no matter where he went, the same questions haunted him. Why? Why did she do it? Why wasn't I enough? One evening, as Jake sat in the garage with a beer in hand, his friend Mark showed up unannounced. Mark had known Jake since college and could tell immediately that something was wrong. You've been avoiding my calls, Mark said, pulling up a stool. What's going on? Jake hesitated, staring at the bottle in his hand. It's Andrea, he said finally. She cheated on me. Mark's eyes widened. What? Andrea? Are you sure? Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. Found the emails. Caught her in a lie. She admitted it. Damn, Mark said, shaking his head. I don't even know what to say, man. That's rough. Yeah, Jake muttered. That's an understatement. Mark leaned forward, his tone serious. What are you going to do? Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. She says she wants to fix things, but I don't know if I can forgive her. I don't even know if I want to try. Mark nodded slowly. Look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I will say this. Whatever decision you make sure it's for you. Don't stay just because you feel obligated, and don't leave just because you're angry. Take the time to figure out what you really want. Jake stared at his friend, the weight of his words sinking in. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess that's all I can do. Later that night, Jake returned to the house to find Andrea sitting at the dining table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up. Would you ever forgive someone if they cheated once, but swore it would never happen again? Write in the comments. When he walked in, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "Out," Jake replied curtly, grabbing a glass of water. Andrea stood, wringing her hands nervously. "Jake, please," she said. "Can we talk?" Jake sighed, leaning against the counter. "What is there to talk about, Andrea? You cheated. You lied. What more is there to say?" "I want to make things right," Andrea said desperately. "I want to rebuild what we had." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Rebuild? Andrea, you burned it to the ground. You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to the way it was." "I know," Andrea said, tears spilling over. "I know I've destroyed your trust, and I hate myself for it. But I love you, Jake. I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you." Jake stared at her, his emotions swirling. He could see the pain in her eyes, the sincerity in her words. But he couldn't shake the image of her sitting across from Greg, sharing secrets and smiles that should have belonged to him. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice breaking. "Why did you do it, Andrea? Was I not enough for you?" Andrea sobbed, shaking her head. "It wasn't about you," she said, her voice trembling. "It was about me. I felt lost, like I wasn't good enough, like I wasn't the person I wanted to be anymore. And Greg made me feel seen, like I mattered." Jake's chest tightened as her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "And I didn't make you feel that way?" he asked bitterly. Andrea looked down, her tears falling harder. "You did," she whispered. "You always have. But I let my insecurities get the better of me. And I made the worst mistake of my life because of it." Jake turned away, his fists clenched. "You had a choice, Andrea. You could have talked to me. You could have let me in. But instead, you turned to someone else. How am I supposed to forgive that?" Andrea stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm begging you, Jake. Don't give up on us. Let me show you that I'm still the woman you fell in love with." Jake sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I need time," he said finally. "Time to figure out if I can even do this." Andrea nodded, her tears spilling over. "Take all the time you need," she whispered. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jake avoided Andrea as much as he could, retreating into his own thoughts. She, in turn, gave him space, but her attempts to reach out were constant. Texts, small gestures, and tearful apologies that only deepened his internal conflict. One evening, Jake found himself sitting in the living room with their wedding album in his lap. He flipped through the pages, staring at the smiles and laughter captured on their special day. It felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory of a love he wasn't sure he could ever reclaim. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that carried the weight of too many unspoken words. Jake sat in the living room, the wedding album still open on his lap. The photos stared back at him, frozen memories of a time when love seemed simple, unbreakable. Now, that love felt fragile, like a delicate thread stretched too far. Andrea walked in, her footsteps tentative. She had given Jake the space he'd asked for, but it was clear the waiting was wearing on her. She paused in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. "Jake," she said softly, "can we talk?" Jake looked up, his expression tired but calm. "I think we need to." Andrea nodded, taking a seat across from him. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, her face pale, and her eyes rimmed with red. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Jake began, his voice steady but heavy. "About what happened, about the life we've built, and about whether we can come back from this." Andrea's breath hitched, her hands trembling in her lap. "I'll do anything, Jake," she said quickly. "Anything to prove to you that I'm committed to us. that I love you. Jake held up a hand, silencing her. This isn't just about you, Andrea. It's about me. About whether I can let go of what you've done and rebuild the trust you broke. I know, Andrea whispered, her tears spilling over. And I know it won't be easy. But I'm willing to fight for us, Jake. Please, just give me a chance. Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. I want to believe you, Andrea. I want to believe that we can fix this. But every time I look at you, all I see is the lies. All I feel is the betrayal. And I don't know if I can live like that. Andrea sobbed, her body shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I'll wait as long as it takes, she said, her voice muffled. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. Jake's chest tightened at her words. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. But sincerity didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the choices she had made. That night, Jake stayed up late, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. He thought about the life they had built together, the love they had shared, and the moments that had made their marriage worth fighting for. But he also thought about the lies, the betrayal, and the hurt that still lingered like a wound that refused to heal. By morning, he had made his decision. Andrea was sitting at the dining table when Jake walked in, her eyes filled with hope and fear. She stood as he approached, wringing her hands nervously. Have you thought about it? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, his expression solemn. I have. Andrea held her breath, waiting. I've decided to stay, Jake said finally. But this is your last chance, Andrea. If you lie to me again, if you betray my trust again, we're done. No second chances, no excuses. Andrea's tears spilled over, and she nodded quickly. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving me a chance. I promise you, Jake, I'll never hurt you like this again. The weeks that followed were a fragile dance of rebuilding. They attended counseling sessions, where Jake vented his anger and Andrea admitted to her guilt. They set boundaries, created routines to foster transparency, and worked on communication. For Jake, the road to forgiveness was long and uneven. There were days when the anger and doubt threatened to consume him, but there were also moments of connection, moments that reminded him of the love they had once shared. Andrea, for her part, was relentless in her efforts to prove her commitment. She cut ties with Greg completely, changed her phone number, and dedicated herself to regaining Jake's trust. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, Andrea turned to Jake, her expression tentative. Do you think we'll ever really heal from this? She asked softly. Jake stared at the horizon, the colors of the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I don't know, he admitted, but I think we're trying, and maybe that's enough for now. Andrea smiled through her tears, reaching for his hand. I'll keep trying, Jake. Every day, for as long as it takes. Jake squeezed her hand gently, allowing himself a small flicker of hope. So will I. Their marriage wasn't the same as it had been before, but perhaps that was for the best. Together, they were building something new, something more honest, more resilient. And as they sat beneath the fading light of the day, hand in hand, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way forward.